I let my wife go out with her friends, as she sometimes did. She told me it would be a night of conversation, laughter, and wine. A night to relax, forget the stress of the week. Everything seemed normal. And, to be honest, I wanted to believe that was how it was, normal. The kind of normal that hides in routine, that you don't question because it's easier that way. Deep down, I knew there was something wrong, a shadow hanging over everything. Something changed between us. The way she looked at me, the excuses that she was tired, the nights she spent away, the cell phone that was never anywhere but in her hands. But I tried to convince myself that it was paranoia, that I was just imagining things, that it was insecurity on my part. After all, if I questioned it, I would be questioning everything we had built. And maybe I wasn't ready to find out the answers. That night, however, was different. A voice in my head insisted, bothered me, as if something was about to happen. Curiosity consumed me. And, driven by an anguish that I could no longer control, I decided to show up unexpectedly. I wasn't the controlling type, never was. I always gave freedom, I trusted. But something, a primitive intuition, made me change my mind. I grabbed my keys, started the car, and drove to where I knew she would be. Or rather, where she said she would be. At the bar, I expected to find her with her friends, laughing out loud like she always did. But what I found was completely different. The scene that unfolded before my eyes felt surreal, as if I were watching the life of someone else, a stranger. I saw her. With him. The touch of hands, the sparkle in her eyes, a smile I hadn't seen in a while, not for me. I hid in the shadows, watching. My heart was racing, and every second filled me with an anger I had never felt before, a bitter mix of betrayal, pain, and an irrational urge to confront. I picked up the cell phone. The camera was shaking in my hands, but I needed to record it. I needed to have proof. I needed to show her that I knew, that I had seen, that lies no longer had a place between us. And as I captured those images, I felt my chest tighten, break into 1,000 pieces. Hours later, at home, she entered as if nothing had happened, as if she were returning from an ordinary night. She still had that smile on her face, the smile of someone who believes she is safe, that everything is still under control. I stared at her, I couldn't speak, my words choked with anger. And she, for a moment, hesitated. What it was? Did something happen? Her voice shook slightly, and at that moment I knew she was about to be unmasked. You think I don't know? My voice was low, firm. Do you think I'm stupid? She turned pale, almost colorless. Her eyes widened, and for a few seconds, she tried to come up with an excuse, a way out. I can explain, but I didn't want to hear it. I showed the photos. The evidence that captured his betrayal in full light in the bar, like a sighting that I never wanted to do. She tried to deny it, tried to convince me that it was a mistake, that I was exaggerating, seeing things. Please forgive me. I made a mistake. She knelt down, tears falling down her face, begging for my forgiveness. But my decision was already made. There was no going back, not after that. Skirt. Now. My voice was cold, empty. There was no more love, there was no more compassion. She tried to resist, tried to touch me, to get closer, but I moved away. The pain had turned into something stronger, something more relentless. With every tear she shed, I felt more determined. And when she finally left, her eyes full of regret and despair, I knew there was no way for us anymore. I had made up my mind, divorce. End. A definitive break. But what I didn't know was that this betrayal was just the surface of something bigger. There was another hidden betrayal, a twist I could never have predicted. And the secret behind it was closer than I imagined. A betrayal within a betrayal, which would reveal that my wife was not solely responsible for what happened. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, in any way, any type of betrayal. The stories told are fictional, but they are a mirror of reality that shows how betrayal destroys lives, relationships, and families. Get ready, because what you will hear is a shocking story, full of twists, and you will discover how far betrayal can lead. Good story. Boston dawned with cold, humid air, like any other typical autumn morning. For Richard, however, that day felt different. He was a man in his early 30s, with dark hair beginning to lose its vigor to gray strands and a calm presence that caused many to consider him a stable figure. Richard was the type who valued routine, the simple things in life, and the love he had for his wife was the foundation of everything he did. Catherine was the woman next to Richard. She was always seen as someone who brought color to the couple's lives. Her green eyes sparkled when she talked about her projects, ideas, or simply when she told any story that made her laugh at herself. She had this captivating energy, a natural magnetism that made everyone around her want to be around her. Catherine was a free spirit, at least that's how everyone saw her. And Richard always supported her. From the beginning, he never wanted to be an obstacle to her dreams, and that was one of the reasons he loved her so deeply. Their marriage was considered solid by many. Richard and Catherine were that couple who seemed to have been born for each other, who had their lives planned out and shared moments of complicity, or at least that's what it seemed like. They lived in a beautiful Victorian-style house, a 3-story building with wooden details and a small garden in front. In the neighborhood, they were known as the perfect couple. The type of relationship that other couples wanted to have, always so synchronized, so attentive to each other. The laughter between them was constant, and at family events, they were seen holding hands, exchanging complicit glances. However, there was something different in recent times. Richard didn't know exactly when it had started, but there was a slight distance that hadn't been there before. A kind of silent abyss, invisible, but present. Catherine, previously always present and affectionate, now seemed to have become a more reserved woman. The nights they spent together on the couch watching movies were interrupted by the messages she received on her cell phone. She covered it up, saying it was work or a group of friends, but Richard knew something was off. I just didn't know exactly what. Maybe it was tiredness, routine, or simply the natural change that life together brings. But, even with these concerns, Richard tried to keep everything as it was. He took Catherine to dinners, planned weekends away to try to reconnect. And for a few moments, he believed things were back to normal. In Catherine's smiles, he saw the woman he had fallen in love with and, in the sweet words she said to him before bed, he found comfort and hope that this was just a phase. Something that all couples go through. Catherine, in turn, clung to this duality. She knew Richard was a good man. She knew he loved her, that he would do anything for her. But there was something that worried her. She felt an emptiness that, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't fill it. The perfect life I had didn't seem so perfect. The choices she had made led her to where she was, but the weight of routine and expectations pressed down on her. Catherine didn't know exactly how to deal with that feeling of restlessness, of needing something more. She wondered, silently, if that was all life had to offer. It was in this context that friendship with Emily became a refuge for Catherine. Emily had been her best friend since she was a teenager. A woman with strong opinions, who always encouraged her to live life to the fullest, not to let herself be trapped by anything. She was different from Richard, bolder, less restrained, and often the voice Catherine listened to when she was in doubt about what to do. Emily brought a sense of freedom that Catherine desired and, with it, a drive that made her question her choices. In recent months, Emily and Catherine have started seeing each other more frequently. "You deserve to live, Kath. Don't let yourself be suffocated," she said in her conversations filled with wine and laughter. And Catherine, little by little, began to hear that voice more intensely. She wanted to live, and live without strings attached. Emily seemed to understand Catherine's anguish more than anyone else. "Richard is a great guy, but does he understand who you really are?" Emily teased, planting seeds of doubt that Catherine watered without realizing it. Richard noticed the increase in these nighttime outings, but tried to avoid conflicts. I didn't want to be that possessive or controlling husband. It's just Catherine being Catherine, he told himself, trying to accept the narrative she was telling him. And maybe she really was just needing some time to herself. He wanted to believe it. That particular night, Catherine went out to meet Emily and some friends. That's what she told Richard. And he, as always, nodded, with that encouraging smile he always gave her. Have fun, he said, as he watched her walk out the door. But unlike other nights, Richard couldn't relax. He lay awake, alone in the room, his thoughts flowing in a confused way, wondering where she was, what she was doing. Across town, Catherine struggled to convince herself that everything was fine, that things were under control. And Emily was there, as always, reinforcing that feeling. You deserve to be happy, Kath, she repeated, looking into her friend's eyes with a conviction that almost convinced her that it was all true, that she was doing what was right for herself. And so, the night continued, with Richard at home, in the solitude of his own doubts, and Catherine experiencing a freedom that she herself still didn't know how to explain. Each of them, in separate worlds, trying to find an answer to what they felt. A night like so many others. At least, that's what it seemed like. But what they didn't know was that it would be one of the last nights of their lives as they knew it. Fate was about to reveal something that would change everything forever. The clock on the living room wall said 11:30 at night, and Richard was still sitting on the sofa, looking at the television turned on at a low volume, but not paying attention to anything at all. His mind was racing. Catherine hadn't given any news, which wasn't exactly unusual, but that night seemed charged with something different. An anxiety he couldn't explain took over his chest. Her messages, which were normally punctual, were absent this time. And, even though he tried to rationalize the situation, she was with Emily, with her friends, having fun, the uneasiness only grew inside him. After looking at his phone for the third time and finding no new messages, Richard made a decision that seemed almost instinctive. He took the car keys, without thinking too much, and left. The night was cold, but he didn't feel the icy breeze that bit his skin as he drove to the bar where he knew Catherine hung out. His mind was clouded, dominated by a whirlwind of thoughts. Maybe he just wanted to confirm that everything was okay, that she was with her friends, smiling, like she always did. Upon arrival, the bar was packed. Loud music, laughter and voices mixed together, creating a chaotic atmosphere that made Richard feel even more out of place. He looked around, trying to find Catherine's familiar face, or perhaps Emily's. However, as he walked among the people, it was only when he reached the back of the bar that his eyes finally came across the scene he never expected. There she was. Catherine, sitting at a private table, but not with her friends. She was with another man. The smile she wore was different, intimate, filled with something Richard hadn't seen in a long time. There was an intensity in her eyes that struck him like a sharp blade. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could clearly see the subtle touch of Catherine's fingers sliding down the man's arm, the way she tilted her head closer to him, as if the world around her had disappeared. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. A mixture of fury and disbelief took over his body. His heart beat uncontrollably, his breathing became heavy, and every fiber of his being screamed for him to run away. But he remained, motionless, observing that scene for a few seconds, seconds that seemed like an eternity. He needed to be sure of what he was seeing, he needed to record it. His instinct took over. The cell phone in his hand, almost without thinking, was brought to his face, and he took several photos. Photos that captured Catherine's smiling face, the sparkle in her eyes, the clear intimacy between her and the unknown man. At that moment, Richard's world seemed to fall apart. And all the doubts he had tried to ignore for weeks were confirmed. She was cheating. The woman he loved, who he always supported and would do anything for, was cheating on him. Richard left the bar almost tripping over his own feet. He felt like he was drowning, a feeling of emptiness expanding inside him as he drove home. His hands shook on the steering wheel, and the tears he couldn't hold back ran down his face. He couldn't understand, couldn't process what had just happened. How could it have been hidden for so long? How could Catherine lie so well? And why? He relived every detail of what he saw in the bar, trying to find some clue, some sign that he might have missed. When he finally arrived home, the emptiness in the room seemed to swallow him. He dropped his cell phone on the sofa and sat down, staring into space, breathing raggedly. The image of Catherine with that man was burned into her mind. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew nothing would be the same after that night. As he waited, his mind was already forming a plan. He would confront her. And so Richard waited. It was almost 2 hours later that Catherine walked through the door. He tried to act naturally, but his surprise at seeing Richard still awake was obvious. "Are you awake? Couldn't sleep?" Her voice sounded normal, as always, but Richard could see through the facade. He looked straight into her eyes, trying to find any trace of regret, of guilt. "We need to talk," was all he could say. Catherine hesitated, a shadow of concern crossing her face, but she maintained her composure. "What happened?" she asked, trying to sound nonchalant, but there was a subtle tremor in her voice. Richard picked up his cell phone from the sofa and, without saying anything else, showed the photos. Those images he took in the bar, displayed there, between the two of them. Catherine went pale, her eyes wide, and she almost dropped the bag she was holding. What is this?" She tried to feign confusion, but it was clear she knew exactly what she was looking at. "I know," said Richard, his voice hard, cutting. "I know everything. I saw you, Catherine. I saw you with him." The mask fell, and Catherine, in shock, could not hide her despair. She tried to speak, tried to find words to explain, to deny, but there was nothing she could say at that moment. Tears started to run down her face, and she reached out, trying to touch him, begging. "Please, Richard, I can explain," but Richard walked away, feeling the weight of every lie she told, every night she had gone out, leaving him behind. And at that moment, he knew that the confrontation that would follow would be definitive, but the worst was yet to come. Because Catherine's betrayal was just the beginning of something much deeper, a secret that Richard would never imagine. Tension hung in the air like a crushing weight as Richard stared at Catherine. Her face was marked by fear and despair at being discovered, while he, on the other hand, had an impenetrable expression, a mixture of pain and anger that she had never seen before. She was still paralyzed, staring at the photos he had taken, desperately trying to find an explanation. But there was no excuse, there was no escape. Richard knew, he had seen, and now she needed to face the consequences. "Speak," he said, his voice cold and dry as the biting wind outside. "Speak up before I completely lose my mind." Catherine took a deep breath, her attempt to maintain her composure was in vain. She knew she was trapped. I don't know what to say, Richard. I was wrong, I know, but, wrong?" he interrupted, anger finally breaking the surface. "Wrong? Do you think this is just a mistake? That going around, lying to me, sleeping with another man, is just a little slip-up?" He stood up suddenly, the chair falling back from the sudden movement. "You lied to me. For us. For how long, Catherine? How long were you seeing him while I was here, believing in you, trusting you?" She tried to respond, but the words died in her mouth. The tears began to flow down her face, and she tried, in vain, to find a way out. "Richard, please, I know it sounds horrible, but I didn't want it to be like this. She tried to touch his arm, but Richard pulled away, as if her touch was something toxic. "Did you care at any point?" He looked into her eyes, waiting for a sincere answer. "At some point, did you think of me? Did you think about us?" Catherine was silent. The weight of guilt was too much to bear, and she didn't know what to say. All she wanted at that moment was for the ground to open up and swallow her. I didn't want to face his gaze, his judgment, but I knew there was no way to escape. And then Richard said the only thing left to say, "Go away. Get out of this house now. I don't want to see you, I don't want to hear you, I don't want anything to do with you anymore." But before she could get her things, the doorbell rang. A sound that cut the air like a knife, interrupting the explosion of emotions unfolding between them. Richard frowned, not understanding who could be there at that time. Catherine glanced at the door, the look of surprise and panic evident on her face. Who will it be at this time?" she murmured, trying to remain calm, but Richard didn't respond. He walked to the door, opened it once, with fury still burning in his chest, ready to expel anyone who was there. And then he saw her. Emily, standing there, with a look that Richard couldn't decipher. She looked tense, almost as scared as Catherine. "Emily?" Richard asked, confused and irritated. "What are you doing here? Do you know what's going on?" Emily took a deep breath and entered, closing the door behind her. His gaze went straight to Catherine, as if they were having a silent conversation, something Richard didn't understand, but which clearly meant something important to both of them. "Richard, please," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to talk. I need to tell you something." Richard snorted impatiently. "And what do you have to do with it? It's between me and Catherine. What did you come here for? To defend her? To try to convince me to forgive her? Because if that's the case, you'd better leave now, Emily." "It's not that," Emily replied quickly, almost desperately. She looked at Catherine again, as if silently asking for permission to continue. Catherine nodded, her eyes shining with tears. It was clear that something else was going on, something Richard didn't know about. And he didn't know if he wanted to know. "What's going on here?" Richard's voice was shaking, not just with anger, but with fear. Afraid that what came next would be worse than he already knew. He looked at Catherine and Emily, two people who had been a part of his life, now involved in something he couldn't understand. Emily swallowed. She knew there was no easy way to say what she was about to say. "Richard. I was the one who told you about Catherine's betrayal." Silence took over the room. The revelation was like a punch to Richard's gut. He looked at Emily in disbelief. What? Did you know? You knew and didn't tell me?" Emily shook her head. "No, it wasn't like that. I told you, but anonymously. I sent the messages. Those messages from an unknown number, saying that Catherine was cheating on you." Richard tried to remember, the messages he had received, the ones he ignored at first. He never knew where they came from, but they were direct, cruel. He had chosen not to believe them, thinking they were just lies, or some kind of hoax. But now it made sense. It made perfect sense. "But why would you do that? Why didn't you tell me at once?" Richard felt his head spinning, the confusion was too much. "You are her best friend. How could you do that? Why are you here now telling me this?" Emily looked at Catherine one last time, and Richard saw something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. A deep guilt, something that Emily carried, perhaps for a long time. Because, Emily started to speak, but her voice trailed off. She forced herself to continue, knowing there was no escape. "Because I knew she was cheating on you, Richard. I knew everything from the beginning. And I was the one who encouraged her." Catherine closed her eyes tightly, feeling the weight of Emily's words. Richard felt as if the ground was collapsing beneath his feet. "You, what?" He was furious, his voice now loud, echoing through the room. "Did you know everything? Did you know and do nothing? Did you encourage her?" Emily began to cry, her voice shaking as she tried to explain. "Richard, I thought I was helping. I thought I was doing what was best for Catherine. I didn't know it would come to this. Get to that point. Richard laughed, a bitter, pain-filled laugh. Going so far as to betray me, to end our marriage? Is that the best you could do for her? Emily shook her head, her words trailing off as emotion took over her. I just wanted her to be happy. I thought that you didn't make her happy enough. Richard didn't know what to do with that information. His world was crumbling before his eyes. Catherine's betrayal, now Emily's betrayal, it all felt like an endless nightmare. He looked at Catherine, who was still standing silently, tears streaming down her face, and the last thing he could say was, I can't believe you too. You destroyed everything. He turned away from them, his mind spinning with all the revelations. And in that instant, he knew that nothing could undo what had been broken. But there was something more, something he didn't yet know. A secret that they both carried, and that, in some way, would be the final key to understanding that whole nightmare. The silence between the three was unbearable. Richard could think of nothing but the double betrayal that had been revealed. His wife and his best friend, plotting behind his back, acting as if nothing was happening while he lived his life immersed in the lie of a solid marriage and a sincere friendship. He looked at Catherine and Emily, both in tears, but he couldn't empathize. Everything seemed empty, every word they said sounded false, as if everything had been part of a great cruel game. And now, the truth was there, naked, painful, and he had to decide what to do with it. I can't believe you, Richard said, unable to hide the tremor in his voice. He ran a hand through his hair in a futile attempt to organize his thoughts, but every movement seemed to take him back to the same place of despair and anger. You played with my life. How did you expect this to end? Catherine moved closer, desperately trying to touch Richard, but he backed away again. Her every attempt to get closer seemed to further increase the invisible barrier between them. Richard, I know I made a mistake. I know you must hate me now. But please, I just wanted, what did I just want? He interrupted her, the tone of his voice sharp. What did you want, Catherine? Make me look like an idiot? Humiliate me? Or was this just a way of getting rid of me? His voice cracked at times, and he found it becoming increasingly difficult to maintain control. Emily, who was standing next to Catherine, finally found the courage to speak. Richard, I never wanted it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. She stopped, seeing Richard's look of disbelief and fury. I knew nothing I said would be enough. He turned to her, pointing his finger, his eyes fixed as if he was burning her with his gaze. You betrayed me as much as she did, Emily. You pretended to be a friend, a confidant, but all the time you were encouraging my wife to cheat on me. Do you understand what you did? Catherine, seeing Richard's lack of control, finally gave in to her own despair. I'm sorry, Richard. I'm sorry for everything. I wanted to tell you before, but I was scared. I thought I could fix this, that maybe it was just a bad moment, and that I would get over it. But you didn't try, he shouted, interrupting her. You never tried to fix anything. He just kept lying to me, to us. And you, Emily, he turned his face to her, full of disgust. You destroyed everything we had. What do you think will happen now? The tension seemed to make the air in the room heavy. Catherine and Emily looked at each other, unable to say anything. It seemed like any word they said would only make the situation worse. The silence was unbearable, and Richard felt like he was trapped in a vortex of emotions that he couldn't control. He needed answers, but he didn't know if he wanted to hear more. I didn't know if I could bear it. That's when Emily finally broke the silence, speaking hesitantly, almost pleading. Richard, maybe we can talk, understand what went wrong, try. There's nothing left to understand, Richard cut in sharply. What went wrong is very clear to me now. And it's not just about Catherine or what she did. It's about you too. About how you lied to me, about how you destroyed the trust that existed. This is unforgivable. Catherine, in tears, looked at Emily as if hoping she would say something, anything that might diffuse the situation. But they both knew there was no going back. The damage was done, and Richard didn't seem willing to hear any more explanations or justifications. He was beyond comprehension, beyond any attempt at reconciliation. What was left there was just the devastating silence of what had once been a relationship full of love and trust. Richard, desperately trying to find some kind of answer within himself, turned and began walking through the house. His heart was beating fast, and he felt like the world was about to fall apart for good. Every corner of that house now seemed like a bitter reminder of everything he had lost. The photos on the walls, the furniture, the familiar smell, everything seemed to suffocate him. And at that moment, he realized he couldn't stay there. No more. He grabbed his coat, his car keys, and headed for the door. Catherine ran after him, grabbing his arm, tears still streaming down her face. "Please, Richard, please don't leave like this. Let's talk. I need you to listen to me, that you." He pushed her away with a sudden movement, without even looking back. "I need to get out of here. I need to think. And you need to find a place to go. When I get back, I want you to be out of here." Richard left, slamming the door shut, leaving Catherine and Emily behind. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house, leaving an emptiness that seemed to fill every space. Catherine fell to the floor, crying uncontrollably, while Emily tried to comfort her, still unsure how things had gotten to that point. Neither of them knew how it would all end, but they knew they had crossed a line that could not be undone. Richard got into the car, started the engine, but was unable to drive immediately. He stood there, looking at the empty street in front of him, trying to find some way out of the situation he found himself in. His chest felt heavy, his heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. He knew that nothing would be the same as before. And as the street lights illuminated his face, Richard realized that tonight would be just the beginning of something he wasn't ready to face yet. But one thing was certain, no matter how much it hurt, he would have to deal with the truth that had been revealed. And when he did, he would finally discover what was hidden behind all that betrayal, a secret that would change everything forever. Days have passed since Richard left the house that night of discovery and anger. He had isolated himself, looking for a place where he could breathe without feeling the weight of betrayal. During this time, there was no contact with Catherine or Emily. He knew he needed space to process everything that had happened, but at the same time, he knew the final confrontation was yet to come. And it would be inevitable. It was on a cold and cloudy morning that Richard decided to return home. Upon entering, he found the house empty, as he had requested. Catherine's belongings were gone, and silence now reigned. He sat down on the couch, the same couch he had been on the night everything fell apart, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel the pain in its entirety. Tears he had held back for days finally flowed, and he cried. Not only because of what he had lost, but because of what he thought he had that, in the end, never really existed. While Richard was deep in thought, Catherine faced the chaos her life had become. She had left the house as he had demanded, but that hadn't made her any less broken. Not knowing where to go, she had spent nights in cheap hotels and then at Emily's house. The two were wallowing in guilt and frustration. Emily tried to comfort her friend, saying that time would resolve things, but Catherine knew that time was not enough to correct what she had done. She had lost everything, the husband she loved, the trust he had in her, and now there was no going back. Emily was also not immune to the consequences of her actions. Guilt gnawed at every part of her. The attempt to help Catherine find her happiness ended up destroying both of their lives. She distanced herself from everyone, isolating herself from the world as if she could escape her own decisions. And, even if she didn't admit it to Catherine, she felt that maybe she herself deserved that pain. The weight of the secret she had kept for so long suffocated her, and Emily, for the first time, realized that trying to fix other people's lives doesn't always bring the expected results, sometimes it creates destruction. A week later, Richard decided to confront Catherine one last time, to close that painful chapter in his life. They arranged to meet in a park, where they used to walk together before everything started to fall apart. The place, once full of good memories, now seemed oppressive. When he saw her approaching, he noticed that she looked different. There was no longer that sparkle in his eyes, the energy that he loved so much. Catherine looked smaller, almost unrecognizable, as if she were carrying too heavy a burden. The two were silent for a moment, looking at each other, trying to recognize the person who had been by their side for so many years. Catherine was the first to speak, her voice low, almost lifeless. I don't even know where to start, Richard. I know I screwed up. Richard couldn't hold back a sigh, trying to maintain the calm he had rehearsed. I didn't come here to fight, he said. I came here to end this. Once and for all. Catherine nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I never wanted to hurt you, Richard. I never wanted it to be like this. Richard looked at her, trying to find some sign of the woman he had loved for so many years, but all he saw now was someone lost, someone he could no longer recognize. Do you know what hurts most, Catherine? It wasn't the fact that you betrayed me. It was trusting you, believing we were invincible. And finding out that it was all a lie. No matter whatever you say now, doesn't change what happened. Catherine no longer had the strength to argue. She knew he was right. I'm sorry, was all she could say, her voice breaking. I'm really sorry. I know you do, replied Richard, with a coldness that hit her like a punch. But now, it's too late. After that, the divorce happened quickly. Richard made sure to take care of everything with maximum efficiency, determined to move on with his life. He moved house, changed his routine, trying to find a new way of living without the specter of betrayal chasing him. It was painful, but little by little he found the strength to start again. New friends, new activities, a new perspective on life. It wasn't easy, but he knew that this was the only way to free himself from all the suffering that the past had left behind. Catherine, in turn, distanced herself from everything and everyone, including Emily. She knew she could never forgive herself for what she did to Richard, and living with Emily became impossible. Every encounter, every word exchanged, was a constant reminder of the betrayal. He decided to start from scratch, in a new city, trying to rebuild what was left of his life. Emily, however, was the one who felt the weight of the consequences most intensely. Over the months that followed, she was forced to confront her choices, the way she manipulated the situation and how she ended up destroying the lives of the two most important people to her. The friendship with Catherine, which seemed unbreakable, was destroyed by her own actions, and the guilt was the burden she would have to bear alone. Trying to find a way to make amends for what she did, Emily decided to seek help, diving into a long journey of self-knowledge and therapy. He knew that although he could not change the past, he could learn from his mistakes so as not to repeat the destruction he caused. Richard found peace. Maybe not right away, maybe not without scars. But he understood that sometimes betrayal doesn't just come from one person, but from a broken system of bad choices, secrets, and lies. And in the end, he realized that, as painful as it was, he wasn't responsible for saving anyone but himself. Life went on, different from what he imagined, but ultimately lighter. Now, tell me, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And remember, here, we do not support any type of betrayal, we want to show how it can destroy lives and relationships. Until the next story.